things you can look up in your Salesforce org. And please remember, everything I'm telling you today is for you to get closer and more intimate with your Salesforce org. So, what are logs? There's one very famous person, and quite a few of those, that do logs this way. So this is a captain's log, and it's start date 41242.4, and then he tells us something, and that is obviously Captain Jean-Luc Picard from the Enterprise. You know him? Raise your hands. Is that a familiar figure? Yes? No? Not really? Okay, I'm sorry for that. In any case, since we embarked on travels and embarked on a boat and a ship and crossed the sea somewhere, captains were writing logs. And these logs usually are structured in a very specific way. They tell you who said something, when it was said, and what was said. That's the general structure, and you find it through hundreds of years already, because log writing is an old art, and it is a form of history keeping. Now, if you think now about computers, about how this works with the servers, the internet, and the client, then you see we have multi-layered applications, and each level of that application usually produces a log. For that, I would give you a quick demo by switching over to a web app on the left-hand side and Heroku on the right-hand side. And what will happen, oops, sorry, thank you. What will happen is basically this. How do I get a log from a computer? I open my web page in a browser, I click a few things, a new window shows up, I click a button, and then some colorful text appears. So the idea is here, for example, that I can go on View Logs, and then you will see some colorful text appear. And if I click a button, some more text appears. So far, so good. Pretty simple. Things are getting logged. Now, what about Apex Debug logs now? Why and how are they different? Let me check the time for a second. Awesome. Well, again, I will go into a Salesforce org. I will click a few things. I will click a button on the web page, and some less colorful text will appear. So I go on my Salesforce org, I click Developer Console, put the window over here, I do some editing, if it lets me edit anything. And here's some text. Ta-da! Clap, 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 clap. No. What's the difference? Did you see any difference? Not a lot, right? But there are, in fact, lots and lots of differences. Mainly and mostly because logs for web applications are written all of the time. They're being archived automatically in a good system. Now, Apex Debug Logs do not run at all by default. And that is because they consume a lot of your performance, especially CPU time. They are also not running constantly. They're bound to one transaction. Does everyone know what a transaction is, roughly? A transaction is when a user starts a process in Salesforce, like editing a record, and hits save. That starts a transaction. Then all the triggers run, the order of execution is respected, and when it's done, the transaction ends. That might involve triggers, workflows, etc. But it's not a constant log, like we saw on Heroku. Also, Apex Debug logs do not persist. That means if you forget to set them up, you don't have any. If you forget to download them, you don't have any. And they're always kept for only 24 hours. Also, they run for a specific user. Not as we saw in my first demo, like every click is being logged, but specifically for a user in your org. They also, and that's an interesting thing, log your own customizations only. So you saw I did something in Salesforce, And some logs appeared down here, which I opened up here. And this is the developer console. Now, if I create a price book, if it lets me create a price book, the internet is very slow. What's your guess? If I create a price book, will I get a log here on the right-hand side? Or if I edit this price book? Show of hands. Who thinks a log will be created? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Few of you. And who believes no logs will be created? 3 people. Okay, let's try. No logs were created. Did I do something wrong, ladies and gentlemen? No. Because this is the most important thing. These logs log your own customization only. So only stuff you yourself put into your org. They do not run for system validation. Let me show you. If I create and I will require, will there be a log? No. Why? Because this is a system validation. And system validation are not custom to your org. And Apex Debug Logs have the specialty that they log your customizations only. If you use managed packages from the App Exchange, you don't see those logs either. You only see what's in your org. And here's a little thingy. They are limited to 20 megabytes. That's actually a good news, partly at least, because a few years back, they were limited to 2.5 megabytes. Nowadays, most transactions fit into those 20 megabytes. But what's the problem with 20 megabytes? Have you ever tried reading 20 megabytes of text? Have you any imagination how much that is? That's roughly 4 times the Bible. The Bible is a big book, 4 times. So increasing log size helped us a lot, but also gave us a lot more work. So how do I use them? Well, the fact is that I completely tricked you. See, when I went into Salesforce and pushed a button and said, I'm just pushing a button, Salesforce did some magic in the background. Because when I open up the developer console, and does everyone know what the developer console is and where to find it? Yes? No? Anyone not familiar? No. Good. Excellent. As soon as you open up the developer org, Salesforce does some magic to track your own user. Hence, you get automatically logs. But if you want to set them up properly for anyone else than yourself, then you need to go to Setup. And you go in and type Debug. And the first thing you would do is set up a so-called user trace flag. Now, and why I'm giving you such detailed screenshots, because Apex Debug Logs are one of those topics that are very, very poorly documented in the whole of Salesforce. If you look on Trailhead, you'll find half a module on Apex Debug Logs. That's not a lot. You will get all the resources in the end, so don't fret. I'll get you all the configuration. By trace flags, we decide who or what we want to track. And we have several options. We can use automated process to track. This is a user you define somewhere in Setup for automated processes. You can also track so-called platform integration. That's a recent one in terms of sometimes some internal Salesforce applications change things in your org. And then you say it's a platform integration user when you see last modified byte. And you can track those. Usually I track users, specific users. You could also track specific classes and specific triggers, but since this is not an only developer-related session, we'll skip to users. To repeat, the first step in using Apex Debug Logs is setting up a trace flag, ideally for a specific user and for a specific time, as you can see up here, and you already learned that it's a maximum 24-hour logging time. Please be aware, if you activate logging for a user, the user experience will decrease. because logging is active. So things will get a little slower than anticipated. The worst thing that can happen to you is that you get in a chicken egg problem because you want, for example, to analyze a certain specific thing, but as soon as you turn on debug logs, you, for example, run into CPU time exception. This is something that might happen because debug logs, and that's the most important message today, consume CPU time. Now, after you have decided whom to log, you will then have to decide what to log by debug levels. And there are a lot of debug levels. You can track over 230 log events. You can find out things about the database, about how workflows deform, about validation and callouts. You can find out everything about Apex code, down to variable assignments. And there's quite a few other things. And last one is NBA. Sorry for the poor resolution down there. NBA is not related to basketball. It's about next best action. So you have over 230 log events to select from, and that is quite overwhelming. Hence, if in doubt, please use the default. Also, as soon as you have selected one level or debug level, don't change it. Because changing debug levels will change the way CPU time is confused and will change the way you analyze the log. So when you make your decision, do a few logs with that and don't try to change all the time because it will have impacts in your measurements. And I will show you in an example soonly what they are. Why did Salesforce increase the log size from 2.5 MB to 20 MB? Because we developers complained that we didn't see lick in our debug logs. So before we were actually down to the chase and the juicy bits, the log was already terminated and my Apex class wasn't even mentioned in there. But as I said, 20 megabytes might cover 99.8% of all transactions, but it's a lot of things to read. And that's the cue for our next topic, how to read debug logs. What you see up there is a typical line from a debug log. And roughly speaking, as shown you in the introduction, it also covers the when, the who, and the what. Let's go a little deeper. One of the more confusing things is when you see something like external coming in. And the first bit is actually here to tell you the line number of an Apex class. But when Salesforce cannot identify the line number of an Apex class, it will write external, even for its own triggers. Because triggers are not really activated by our own code, but rather a system thing that then runs our Apex code. The log line is actually hidden. And when it's hidden, Salesforce says external. Don't get surprised. No one is hacking your org or anything. That is documented behavior. The next thing for this particular log line is the trigger record ID, because as you might know, Apex triggers also are as objects, hence have a record trigger ID. And then you see the trigger name, and you also can see the trigger event, like before insert. That constitutes the what part of the log. Let's look at another example. We have, again, when, who, and what. In this time, I also gave you a little bit of code, nothing special. It's a test class, and in this test class, a product gets configured, let's say configured, and then inserted into the database in line 6. So I give the product a name, test product, and then I do assertion and say, look, I want to see if there's really an ID. Please note there's new assert messages now in Apex, use them, they're awesome. And again, the what part consists of several parts. It says you again what happened, DML begin in this time. It gives you clearly the line of code, line 6. It also tells you what's the operation, it's insert. It will tell you which object you inserted and how many rows you have inserted. Okay, that's reading logs line by line. Now, as I said, this is an introductory session. Most of people who are not developer usually don't go through logs line by line. I love it, but not everyone does. So what else can you do with debug logs if you're not a developer, if you're an admin, if you're an architect, or even an interested business user and have the right access, right? Users shouldn't have access to developer console, by the way. Well, first of the thing, there's a very specific part in the Apex Debug logs, if you use the standard defaults, that tell you about the limits that are consumed. But once again, this is a Heisenberg problem, because as soon as you switch on the debug logs, you will consume more limits. And it will give you all the details you need. It will tell you how many SOCL queries there are, 3 here in my example. They will tell you how many records were retrieved from the database during my transaction, 8 for example. And it will also tell me something about the CPU time used. As you know, CPU time is a very, very hard limit on a Salesforce platform. And in this transaction, I used 307 milliseconds, so that's pretty okay. But what else is there? Now, the developer console is a pretty amazing tool if it's not slowing down your machine. So use it with care, and if you use 20 MB logs, be aware it will take some time to load. But the developer console has a magic power, which is perspectives. And if you are the developer console, you can click debug and then switch perspective and then click analysis. And how that looks like, I will show you in a second. There's another little gray area here that points to the checkbox show my current logs only. So if you set up a trace flag for a different user than your own, the logs will only show up in setup, there where you defined them. If you want to see them in the developer console in order to use analysis view, you need to uncheck that checkbox. Otherwise, the logs will not be visible to you. And what happens when you go into switch perspective, you go into the analyst view and you get a picture like this. Once again, sorry for the poor resolution. What you see there is basically performance heaven or performance analysis heaven, because you can see how the order of so how the transaction actually worked. You see here that, well, I can see it, you can't read it, but I will tell you. You see that an Apex trigger is running here in the red part. Then you see there's validation running in the green part. Then come again some Apex triggers that run. And at the end of the day, some workflows are being executed. You have different, so the log is up here on the right-hand side, but the interesting things are here in the execution tree and an execution stack, because it also tells you how long each part of the transaction really took. You can drill down and click into these, and you will find milliseconds, you will find further information on heap size, whatever you need to analyze the performance of a specific transaction. Once again, as soon as you analyze the performance of a transaction, you impact the performance of the transaction. That's something that you need to remember all the time. It's not that what your user would see without the debug logs, but it's a clear indication of what happens when. Now, I told you that working with developer console and large logs is difficult. Also, if you open up a log in developer console, please close it again. It's important because the developer console sometimes forgets to put data outside itself and it gets clunky. And a better tool, if you're into VS Code, and thanks to Financial Force for that, is the Apex Debug Log Analyzer. And the cool thing there is that you can use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out through this transaction. So I can zoom here into 0.5 millisecond steps. And I can see that there was a workflow evaluated, and it took 0.825 milliseconds to complete. That's how deep I can go with debug logs and performance analysis. You can also, obviously, for developers, use SFDX to stream the logs into your CLI. And as I said, the developer console is not really colorful, but the streaming of the logs is indeed. Let me take you beyond debug logs for the last part of this demonstration, because as I said, debug logs track one transaction only, and there might be other things you're interested in, like for example, who changed the field, or was this email really sent? And for that, there are many options in the Salesforce org that are not directly related to the developer console. For a use case like who changed that field, please use field history. That's why it's there. And it also gives you a sort of log and history of who did what when. There are many others, admin reports for API usage, identity verification. A very interesting thing is also the email log, but because it will tell you if an email has been sent and to whom. There's also a setup audit trail. But as you see, some of those are UI accessible, some of those are configurable, some of those you can download, some of those you cannot download, some of those you can query. The most versatile one is the Apex Debug Logs, because it supports all of these. Now, if you want to go even beyond that, you need to invest into event monitoring. So if you really want to know what happens in your org, basically in real time, please consider using event monitoring, which also means you are responsible for consuming the events, analyzing the events, and there are many events. Nonetheless, if you need that kind of control, event monitoring is your thing. Now, what if I want to persist things? What if I don't want to have a huge performance impact when logging things? Now, that really depends. See, if you use Apex Debug Logs, you get the internal Salesforce view. You get details on DML statements, meaning something has been changed in the database. You get all the order of execution. But you can also write your custom logs and switch them on and switch them off. And of the three frameworks that I have looked at, I will be talking today about the Nebula logger, which offers persistent logs and live streaming. Since we have poor resolution and poor internet, I'm not going into demo. But the fact is that Nebula logger uses platform events to send the messages that you need out and saves them securely. Now, obviously, that takes a little bit of performance as well, but you can simply switch it on and off, and you have a live stream. And it will only log what you tell him to log. And the Apex Debug Logs have trace flags and the debug levels, but they're really system-wise, and they will consume more performance than this kind of logging, full stop. And as you can see, you also get a live view here. So you can monitor many users at once if you wanted to. And it has very great possibilities to dig down. It also does data masking for you. So one of the things about debug logs is, what if PII information is there? Then we're liable in some sort. Hence, we shouldn't have any personal information in logs, because then we're responsible to clean them and remove personal references. Nebula logger does indeed offer something like data masking, and hence is one of the most sophisticated loggers currently available for free, because it's completely open source. And you can learn a lot by looking at the architecture and how they build it. And I'm really glad that they invested there, because the other for logging frameworks you will see in the resources in the end never went beyond an MVP or a technical POC. This is product level, really. So, and it comes, ta-da, with a Slack integration. So this is currently in beta, but you could stream your logs immediately into Slack or specific log lines and tell people to act on them. I personally don't like to be notified a lot of the times in Slack, so your mileage may vary, you know? So, but if you think that's a good idea, yes, Nebula logger also does a Slack integration in beta. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will quickly walk you through the resources and open the stage for questions. As I said, there are not a lot of resources in the documentation. That's basically all of it. And there's a little tiny bit on Trailhead. And if you really want to go deeply into logging, personal shameless plug. A few years back, I did a 4-hour course on Pluralsight. Sometimes Pluralsight offers 3 weeks, and you can watch the course for free. If not, you can buy a subscription from Pluralsight and watch it nonetheless, of course. But as I said, there's often a free week for Pluralsight. As for custom solutions for logging, you can download the VS Code extension from Financial Force in order to zoom in and zoom out into the performance view, analysis view. There's the Nebula logger I showed you 2 screenshots of. There's Apex Unified Logging by my colleague and friend and German MVP Robert Sösemann. And there's also the Logger Framework by yours truly. And with that, thank you so much. Shukran. Have a most wonderful day. If there are questions, let me know. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for the great presentation. The least that can be said, it's mesmerizing. So, by the way, I'm Taha from DNA Technologies. Just to put you in context, in one of our many projects, we had so many difficulties. So it's a peculiar case, and we suffered a lot of Apex CPU time limits and performance impacted by debugging logs. So we faced this issue where we needed just to log fatal errors.
Mm-hmm.
So my first question, out of my 10 questions, is have you ever faced any issue any case where you only had to log fatal errors based on the event? And the second question is, the Nebula logger you have just presented, can you just please show the slide where the configuration panel on the left exists?
Yes, in a second. I want to address your first question.
Okay.
Here's a bit of Apex code. And there you can select finest, but you also can select error, which means only errors would be logged. So by that, you can reduce the log size. It might be that your specific error still isn't getting logged. That depends on what type of error we're talking about. Usually this means I need a system.debug statement with the logging level error. But again, you can reduce everything to nothing and just leave Apex on, but don't trust profiling information in that case.
But wouldn't it be more like insightful and practical if there is a solution where logged event can persist based on that fatal error moment without being erased by the time frame?
Yes, if you really want to log persistently your errors, and we need to cut the session right now, sorry for that, then look into custom logging, because then you can even do a filter and say just save error messages and nothing else, and then your custom error messages will be saved, and you can look at them next week or in 3 months and analyze them retroactively.
I think we cannot take more questions because we have to jump on to the other session. So
thank you for joining. Thank you.